Hello, once again, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are joining us. Thank you so much for making time to join us specifically for this webinar that I think is extremely timely, coming at a period of, a lot of anxiety on what's going on in the world, and particularly in the African context. And we're seeing over, a few months, flare up of conflicts here and there. And so our role is really to interrogate these events, try and understand them, what's happening, and also, give our audiences a nuanced, and a contextualized perspective. And today we are extremely lucky to have a very experienced panelists, people that have worked in the region for a very long time, so they understand what is happening, the context, and all that. And I'm extremely privileged today to have Bram, who's joining us from the Institute for Security Studies. And we also have Marisa Lurenko, who's a political analyst in Southern Africa, doing a lot of amazing work in the region. And then we also have Jonathan Beloff, who's also worked extensively in the Great Lakes region. And of course, my colleague, Maria Luisa, who's a very fantastic person. So I think to start off webinar, I just want to sort of give an overview of what is happening and the purpose of this webinar. So I think things have moved very, very quickly in the Eastern DRC since the start of in January. But then a lot of these events really, a culmination of past events, and things that sort of got things moving very quickly. So, for example, sometime in end of January, we started receiving reports of M23 making advances in the region and moving into potentially taking over Bukavu and and Goma in the Eastern DRC, and then later on in the East African community and as well as the Southern African community, which are regional blocs on the continent, convened almost extraordinary summits, and then they came up with recommendations, and later on there was a proposal in particular to have a joint SADC and EAC extraordinary summit, which also came up with a lot of interesting I would say propositions on the way forward. And I think since then things have also quite moved very quickly. We had the DRC issue being debated in the UN Security Council. We've also had the European Union pronouncing itself on the developments in the Eastern DRC, and seen a lot of pressure being exerted on Rwanda, for example. So I think this is an important discussion to have. It's an important conversation to have. So to start off, I think this point I'll invite Bram, from the Institute of Security Studies, to sort of like make his interventions on what is happening in the DRC, give us context, what we know about the conflict, how has it evolved over time, and what role, for example, has M23 played, what role are other armed militia groups, playing in what is it that, and how are these dynamics shaping the security situation in the region, and how is this complicated, relationships between Kinshasa and Kigali. So at this point, over to you, Bram. Thank you so much.
Thank you for this introduction, and thank you for giving me the quite difficult task to set the kind of stage to talk about this, because it has a very long history, this conflict, and also, as you mentioned, there are far more armed groups active beyond M23, and we are in a very new terrain, I think, now since January. But until recently, M23 was not even the most violent armed group in Eastern DRC. So if we talk about conflict in Eastern DRC or security crisis in Eastern DRC, this also goes beyond the M23 rebellion itself, although increasingly these issues are becoming interlinked. So as I want to provide a bit of a background to the current conflict, I think it is important to see in which way also the past works through the present. And if we talk about the past, we also have to talk about those colonial legacies that still play a role today. And those colonial legacies are various different types of legacies. Talk about ethnic identity, racialized notions of ethnic identity that still play in today. The positioning of Kenya-Rwanda-speaking populations in Eastern DRC, which are linked to various patterns of migration in the region, but also forced population movements during the period of colonialism, refugee movements throughout various stages in the 20th century, for example, in 1960. And all of these factors have contributed to, I think, the rather difficult positioning around Congolese Tutsi communities and Kenya-Rwanda speaking communities at large in Eastern DRC. Those identities and the question of citizenship was even further manipulated or part of contestation under the Mobutu period. So these things go way back, as M23 is at least in partly revolves around these interests of Kenya-Rwanda speaking communities in Eastern DRC. A watershed moment in the recent history has been the Rwandan Civil War and the genocide against Tutsi in 1994, as well as the subsequent Congo wars that followed these events. And so a lot of what is into play today in the current conflict also goes back to that period. So most particularly the FDLR, so the Rwandan armed group that is kind of at the heart of this conflict. It dates back to the perpetrators of genocide, and it's an offspring of those who were involved in the genocide. And I think, and I hope that Dr. Belloff also speak to that later, is that current perceptions on the conflict, both from the Rwandan side, but also from the side of the DRC, are very much informed by these past experiences. So even though the FDLR today does not pose a major military threat to Rwanda, it is important to understand the perception of this group from this history and this experience of genocide. In the same way, hostility towards Rwandan interference, Rwandan influence, and also the difficult positioning of Kinyarwanda-speaking communities, particularly Tutsi in Eastern DRC, are also linked to these experiences of the devastating Congo wars that happened in this past. After this period, we have this kind of cyclical pattern of rebellions, and M23, this version, because it's the second iteration of this rebellion, is only one version of this. So I think the current refusal to dialogue by the Congolese government with M23, it is linked to the current political dynamics, but it's also informed by these past experiences of army integration, army defection, failed DDR efforts, all of these aspects also come into play. So if you talk about M23, this group initially emerged in 2012, and it emerged out of dissatisfaction with the way in which a prior peace agreement that was concluded in 2009 with one of its forerunners, the CNDP, which how this peace agreement was concluded, or how this peace agreement was effected. And so it emerged out of that kind of a new defection out of the army. It briefly captured Goma in that part in 2012, but it was also defeated militarily in 2013. And after its military defeat, a lot of its rank and file and its leadership, including political leadership, fled across the border. Most of them fled to Uganda, but also a part went to Rwanda. In 2017, its current military leader, Sultani Makenga, already left Uganda and settled itself in the tri-border area in the DRC, where M23 also researched from in 2021. So let's go to 2021, the context of the resurgence of this movement. And I think there is an internal context to this and a regional context to this. In 2018, there was elections in the DRC, and Tshisekedi comes to power, not because of being elected necessarily, but because of what is now known as a political backroom deal that was made between him and Kabila. And in this, as a result of this, we have a rather weak presidency, because a lot of the political institutions, as well as control over the security institutions, remained with Kabila. And that was a kind of a context that Tshisekedi is seeking to also find more regional support to balance out this rather weak domestic position. And in that context, there is an outreach to Rwanda, and there is a process of what you could call improved relationship between the DRC and Rwanda. And this improvement had an economic component. So there was, for example, agreements were made over collaboration in the gold mining sector, but also about collaboration with Rwanda. But it also had a security component. And so for a while, there's this great security cooperation between the DRC and Rwanda involving operations against FDLR and FDLR-linked groups in Eastern DRC. In that context, also discrete negotiations start with delegates of the M23, because some of these issues around amnesty and army integration remains unresolved. And so we have this period of a kind of honeymooning or rapprochement. We see Tshisekedi visiting the Genocide Memorial in Kigali. Kagame is coming to Kinshasa. There is a volcano eruption in Goma. And Rwanda provides some form of support. So there is really this visible improvement in the relationship, but this is discontinued at one point. And I think this is also linked to political evolutions in the DRC itself. Tshisekedi, by creating a new political coalition called the Union Sacrée, or the Sacred Union, is able to politically outmaneuver Kabila. And at the same time, this cooperation with Rwanda is also not politically not very much welcomed among segments of the population in the DRC. And so actually security cooperation between both countries is discontinued, and the dialogue with M23 is stalled. And at the same time, Kinshasa also improves relationships and increases cooperation with other countries, other neighbors, as Burundi, but also as Uganda. And at this period in time, Rwanda and Uganda have a rather tense relationship. And within this cooperation agreement that DRC signed with Uganda, there is a prospect of Ugandan military presence in Eastern DRC to target Ugandan foreign armed group called the ADF, but also to carry out roadworks on various axes in Eastern DRC, including very close to the Rwandan border. And I think that Rwanda perceived this prospect of Ugandan presence also as something somewhat threatening. And so both this dynamic of stalled negotiations with M23 as discontinued security cooperation with Rwanda and the prospect of Ugandan presence, all of these factors are somehow a background to this resurgence of M23 at the end of 2021. What we have seen since then is a pattern of consistent escalation, with some exceptions, some periods of relative calm, including during the period of the deployment of the East African Community Regional Force. But since 2021, we have basically seen a consistent pattern of expansion of territorial control, as well as consolidation of that control. So M23 rebellion is very much present locally. It has sought local power. But it is also, these ambitions have also grown. And that is in part because of a coalition that was made with a political affiliate called the Congo River Alliance in 2023, which is led by the head of the former head of the Electoral Commission, Corneille Nangaa, which brings a much more political agenda to the movement, provides possibilities of expanding the agenda beyond the somewhat narrow, localized agenda of M23 itself, and also brings the question of regime change, broader political change on the agenda of the movement. I think an important process to mention within these past years is militarization from various sides. So the Congolese government has generally refused dialogue process with M23, which despite some smaller efforts, but in general, what we've seen is a pattern of militarization in various forms. So we have seen the Congolese army resort to cooperation with local armed groups, now coalesced under a kind of loose coalition that is called the Wazalendo, which is Swahili for patriots. Linkages with the FDLR itself have at least been strengthened during this period. We've seen the use of heavy military equipment, armed attack drones. Congolese defense spending was one of the fastest decreasing defense spendings on the African continent. Kinshasa invited in private security contractors, foreign troops, Burundian soldiers, and also South African community deployment. But also on the Rwandan side, we've seen this. We have seen also this pattern of militarization, including the deployment of heavy military equipment that no armed group in the Eastern DRC would be able to acquire or use on its own. These are surface-to-air missiles. We're talking about GPS-guided mortar systems, GPS jamming equipments. And this pattern of militarization has been, I think, a crucial driving factor in the expansion of this rebellion, as well as its regionalization and also its politicization. And the peace processes, which I think we will talk about later, or my panelists will also talk about this later, have been unable to really stop this dynamic. And besides this peace process, another factor in this escalation has also been the rather incoherent or weak international response to this conflict, whereby on all conflict parties there has been not really sustained international pressure, has not really been given in order to de-escalate the situation. To conclude, just some words on the impact of this on the security situation. First of all, the humanitarian impact of this has been devastating. And conflict-induced displacement has never been this high in the DRC. As a result of the recent fighting throughout January, and particularly the heavy fighting around Sake and Goma, has led to the destruction of public services, health facilities, schools have been destroyed. The water delivery systems have been heavily affected. But also Goma itself, it is also a very important hub for humanitarian responses elsewhere. So this affects the closure of the Goma airport, for example, affects humanitarian responses in other areas of Eastern DRC as well, where M23 itself is not necessarily active. And this is also a dynamic to stress that the security situation has not only worsened in the areas of M23 fighting, but also in other areas in the east, in part as a result of security gaps, because much of the fighting was heavily concentrated around Goma. Also, the withdrawal of MONUSCO in South Kivu has also contributed to worsening of the security situation there. And the third aspect of the security situation impact I want to mention before closing is the regional tensions that have only increased, particularly the deployment of Burundian forces in support of the Congolese government against M23 have really increased the risk of a regional escalation of this conflict after the takeover of Bukavu and the progression of the M23 rebellion further southwards. Yesterday, there was a meeting in Bukavu where the intent was stated to progress to Uvira. Uvira is located only, you can see Bujumbura, which is the economic capital of Burundi, from Uvira. It's located right next to the Burundian border. This further expansion of M23 towards these areas really carry with it the risk of a further regional escalation. To conclude, my last sentences, I think the last escalation of the last month has brought us into new terrain. And this is a whole new dynamic that we're seeing unfolding now. And this is a dynamic of both further expansion, escalation, that possibly threatens the stability of the Congolese government and regime itself. But also we see this consolidation happening in the east. A kind of buffer zone around Rwanda has been constructed. We're seeing a parallel administration emerge, and really no signs that this will end anytime soon, or that a withdrawal will happen anytime soon. And so a regional peace process will have to face this reality that this is a movement that clearly intends, states its intent to stay and to build a parallel administration. And so this brings back memories of previous Congo wars, whether they are the first or the second. And lastly, we're also in a new geopolitical context, of course. I hope we can talk about that maybe later. So the context, of course, is also very much different as those in the 90s and early 2000s. This is it for me. I'm going to conclude here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Abram. I mean, you made very important points. I mean, that I think are extremely important to understand. Especially if there's a conscious decision to really try and resolve the conflict. And you mentioned some of the disagreements, especially around whether the DRC should have a conversation or engage with M23, and why that is sort of like the sticking point in all these discussions, which is a good way to transition into the next section of the discussion, because recently, I think last weekend, the African Union had new leadership basically, and a new leader emerged. And then there've been sort of like whispers in the corridors that to some degree whatever is happening in the Eastern DRC could have affected or impacted the outcome of who eventually emerged as the new chairperson of the African Union Commission. So that is an interesting point. And then maybe Marisa, you could build on this, but also, I mean, focus your interventions on why is it that previous mediation efforts have failed. What new approaches should be considered to help move the conversation forward, to help move the peace process forward. What external actors can do. We saw it recently when Turkey even tried to negotiate, but then they were pushed back. I think by DRC, who didn't want anything to do with Turkey. And then we also saw, I mean, sort of like tensions in my view between, they sort of present a unified face, but then I think behind the scenes there's a lot of tensions between the East African community as well as the SADC community, and precisely, I mean, building on what Bram said, the withdrawal of the East African troops and their replacement by SADC forces, which South Africa contributes a large part of the troops. And what is it that we can expect from this? What are some of the risks and opportunities associated with external interventions in the conflict in the Eastern DRC? Please come in and yeah.
Great, thank you, Darlington. And yeah, I'm going to start with, I think, the first part, focusing on how these past mediation efforts have failed to date, and where do we go from here, and what about other external actors? What role do they have to play? And I think this will actually really help to build on what Bram has just discussed about how Tshisekedi has approached mediation. He has approached relations with Rwanda. Because I think that among all of this is, we can say these past mediation efforts have not been working that well. What should we do next? But the thing is that, and I will build on this more as we go through these questions, but Tshisekedi is looking for a military solution. He's not really interested in mediation. So I think we also need to take that into account when we look at why haven't some of these processes worked. And the two processes that I want to focus on, because I think that these are the sort of tells us a lot about his approach, but it also maybe speaks to what might happen going forward. And it's the Nairobi process and the Luanda process. So I think, key to seeing Tshisekedi's dissatisfaction, with calls, to have better mediation efforts and to talk to M23, is we saw already last year, he started to complain about the Nairobi process. So obviously that's led by the Kenyan government, and he started to say, that President Ruto has actually just completely undermined it, and he's not happy with this. It's not really achieving what he believes that it should. And then if we look at the Luanda process, and this is obviously led by the Angolan government, this he's complained a lot less about. But what's quite interesting is that the Angolan president, President Lourenço, has actually called for Tshisekedi and said that he needs to enter into a dialogue with M23, and Tshisekedi just seems to be ignoring this. So you can have this kind of push, But if, Tshisekedi ultimately at the end of the day is the one who sort of holds the power to say whether or not this is, he's going to take this kind of advice. And we've seen him pushing back on so many things. And as I'll discuss a little bit later, we've also seen him just try to reach for so many different kinds of solutions over the last 2 to 3 years, but not really stick to anything. And I think that this is really a key kind of hindrance towards these mediation efforts actually working. In terms of Turkey, for that reason, I can kind of see that, I can kind of understand why he did push back on that. Obviously, none of these players, none of these mediators are impartial players. They're also operating in their own self-interest. But I think Turkey would be a very difficult one for the DRC to accept. Turkey has been involved economically in Rwanda for, I think, over a decade now. It's very interested in its infrastructure development there. But we know that Turkey is not an impartial player. I mean, of course, neither is Angola, but I think with Turkey, it's a lot more obvious that it is pro-Rwanda. And, if I were Tshisekedi as well, I wouldn't want to be on the back foot in those kinds of negotiations. I think what we are going to see going forward is, even though Tshisekedi is looking for a military solution, and even though he's not really listening to what other leaders in the region are saying, I think that the Luanda process is still going to be quite prominent. And the reason for that is because Angola and the DRC are quite close to the US, and we now have heard that Tshisekedi has gone to the US and has asked the US for help in trying to push back M23. The US, I don't think is going. I mean, I don't know what it will do, but I don't think it's going to get so involved in providing a military solution, except maybe nudging the UN peacekeeping force to kind of stay on. But I think that the US is going to try to push Tshisekedi to promote the Luanda process, and maybe to try to listen to what Lorenzo is advocating for. Whether or not this will work, I don't know, because we've seen to date, again, it has not really had much of an impact. And again, Lorenzo's involvement in this is partly because Angola has to make sure that relations with the DRC stay cordial, actually with both Congos, because it's got the Cabinda exclave, the province that's actually geographically located outside of Angola. And that's kind of an agreement between the three countries that, they will let Angola keep that exclave. They will not make any kind of claim to it. But again, that also hinges on good relations between these three countries, so that this doesn't become effectively a kind of conflict over who actually controls that area. But I think definitely with US involvement, this is something that they're going to push for. And I don't think that, as much as Tshisekedi is running around looking for other military options, I still think that that's going to come up in the background. In terms of, we've obviously heard a lot, there's been a big push, for sanctions against Kigali. I'm not really sure that these would kind of work, or even force Kagame to the table, or would make. I mean, Tshisekedi is obviously pushing for it. I don't know if that would really make a big kind of difference. I think we've seen sanctions in other parts of Africa that have not worked very well. A key example is Zimbabwe. There have been sanctions for over a decade by the US and the EU, on not against the country obviously, but against high-ranking officials. And this has not forced any kind of regime change at all. In fact, the ruling party there, the ZANU-PF, just seems to be doubling down. So, and I think also what we have to remember with Rwanda is that it doesn't just interact with the West. China also buys its minerals, so does the UAE. It's also been reaching more and more. It's been getting closer to Middle Eastern players. So, I suppose Turkey could be one, but there's also Qatar. There's also involvement from Israel. So, it's not like sanctions are going to completely cut it off, or sanctions against individuals would completely cut it off from support. I also don't think they would stop the kind of minerals conflict and minerals smuggling that is obviously not the whole story of this conflict, but is obviously a part of it. We see this all over the world, when these kind of routes just get redirected, so maybe they'll just be more kind of covering up if minerals are coming from Rwanda, and it won't actually make a big difference or really harm that. And then again, even if the West does put sanctions on, what about China? Is it also going to stop buying from Rwanda? I think we also have to look at the bigger part of the story there. So yeah, just on the note of Tshisekedi not, and turning now to the tensions between, as you mentioned, Darlington, the tensions between the regional blocs and what has been happening, and then South Africa is also involved there. So this is, I mean, when you sort of go through a list of what Tshisekedi has done, you can just see that there have been many sort of things that he's tried. So first there was the East African communities peacekeeping mandate, which then ended in December 2023. And why this ended again points to Tshisekedi's pursuit of a military solution, because it effectively was a peacekeeping force, and he was looking for a peace enforcement deployment. So that was, I think, really the kind of tension there. And then that made room for the SADC mission to come in with troops from South Africa, Malawi, and Tanzania to come in and actually do more of peace enforcement and not peacekeeping. That we also saw that Kenya last year also gave troops to support the UN peacekeeping mission there, MONUSCO there. And again, this is another thing that Tshisekedi has flip-flopped on, where he ordered the UN to leave, and then now more recently in recent months, he softened that stance and he said, well, actually, no, he doesn't want them to withdraw completely. Of course, the UN's already started the withdrawal. You can't just take back these kinds of big decisions. A lot of this, I think, was just political. The UN, I think, has struggled to get, with the peacekeeping mission specifically, has struggled to get local buy-in. There's obviously been a lot of issues with the deployment there. And, for Tshisekedi to get a handle on things was just to say, look, I don't want peacekeeping, I don't want the UN anymore. But again, that's something that he has backtracked on. And then again, we see him kick out the East African Community Force, but then Kenya forces are allowed to contribute to MONUSCO. So it's really just, it just shows that he's really searching for solutions, that he believes the military solution is there, but he's not really quite sure how to go about it. And it's difficult because he obviously also needs, foreign support, regional support, and all of this kind of backing. And then, of course, we also saw when, in the latest round of the conflict, there's also, he's also been using private military contractors, PMCs, and mercenaries as well. It came out that there were, I think maybe at least 300 foreign mercenaries. Most of them are coming from Romania, and again, getting paid huge amounts of money, very, very expensive. And then the most recent thing is we've seen he apparently has asked the government of Chad for help for them to send troops, and we're not really sure how that's going to play out or what he's thinking there. But Tshisekedi, he helped the Chad political transition process back in 2022, so he's sort of going around and looking for allies across there. But again, it's difficult because you have these mediation processes, but then you have the person who is effectively in control of all of this going around and looking for all of these different solutions, not really committing to one. My main concern here, I think, with his latest move in, asking Chad for help is he isolating, some of his allies in the region, for example, Angola, who I would say is Tshisekedi's strongest ally at present and has been for a number of years. He's really helped to protect Tshisekedi against Kagame, and again, for Angola's own self-interest, but still, he really helped Tshisekedi at a time when Tshisekedi was a much weaker leader. I wouldn't say he's a strong leader now, but he's definitely in a better position than when he first came to power. So yeah, and I think that this is going to be another kind of layer of complexity to this whole situation. We'll be looking at, well, what is really the solution here? And it's a difficult situation because it's not just tied to minerals, it's also tied to nationhood and displacement for decades, as Bram also pointed out and detailed. But definitely not having a kind of consistent approach is, again, adding another layer of complexity to this that I think is not easily solvable at all. And then just looking at, I think lastly, you wanted me to discuss the risks and opportunities associated with external interventions. I think I'll start with the worst one. Whenever you get PMCs and mercenaries involved, I don't think that's ever a good idea, and I don't think it ever really is effective. It undermines the government's power, it undermines the army, which, okay, obviously we know the Congolese army is not that strong, but it also comes at a huge cost to the state. And I think another example we can look at in the region is Mozambique. They have an insurgency up in the north of the country that's been going on. The first major incident is recorded in 2017, and eventually there was also the SADC peacekeeping mission there in the country. But before that, Mozambique also turned to mercenaries, and mercenaries can't be held accountable if there's any kind of human rights violations. They often don't have a very good understanding of the environment that they're operating in. And I even mean like the topography of the environments that they're operating in. And at the end of the day, they tend to sort of just displace the conflict or push it into different areas. And again, we saw this actually even now with the Rwanda Defense Force that's been in Mozambique for the last few years. They haven't managed to really uproot the insurgency or really to weaken it. They just push it out into different areas. This was seen especially when they first entered the country, and the conflict actually spread to neighboring provinces before it had just been isolated to one. And yeah, ever since then, we've seen, yes, the RDF is able to, move the group outside of certain towns or major cities or secure certain routes, but it doesn't actually weaken the group. And yeah, I just think, yeah, when it comes with mercenaries, the cost of it is high and it's not very effective. They also, obviously get paid much more usually than soldiers, and this is just not really good for morale in the army because you obviously still need those soldiers there. You still need them to fight and all of that. So yeah, I think that's a big risk there. The UN peacekeeping force, yeah, it's tough because whenever you have a kind of external intervention, and this can also go for, the SADC mission and then the East African Community one previously, is that a lot of the time they can lack legitimacy among local populations if they're not really trusted by them. This obviously differs, from context to context. I think the UN is a particularly difficult one for the DRC, and that's not the case in every other country. But trying to build up that legitimacy with the local population is tough. And then I think back to what I said earlier about, no external actor is impartial. So they're all going to operate in self-interest. So yes, maybe they can offer some support to the DRC, and that support can be good. And for example, if, there is dialogue with M23, I do think that would be constructive. But again, no external actor is kind of operating here and saying that, okay, they're only doing this for the good of the DRC. They're doing it to avoid a regional conflict. They're also doing it to project their own power into the Great Lakes. And then sometimes they're also used as like a proxy, say by the US, for it to then project power into that region. But yeah, again, I think probably mediation is, the only kind of intervention that would make sense at this point. And I think, if we look at conflict, what really helps to sort of stabilize areas, but it takes a long time, is just improving, socioeconomic conditions. It's less costly than paying troops, but it also takes much longer. And the thing is, politicians want quick wins. And I think that this is what we're with Tshisekedi at the moment. He's trying to say, as long as I'm in office, I'm going to sort this out. The problem is bigger than him. It's going to outlast him. But yeah, I'm not sure he knows that. And I think he's going to carry on isolating key allies and carry on pursuing a military solution at his own risk.
Thank you so much, Maris. I mean, your insights were very, very, nuanced, and I think help give context to what's happening and why this, conflict in particular is extremely difficult, and why over the years, I mean, different actors seem to struggle with, bringing lasting peace to the region. And just building on on what you said, especially, I mean, the role of critical minerals, which DRC has in abundance, and then also I think that connects with the broader geopolitics, pitting whether it's East African, I mean China, Russia and Western countries, and all this playing into the conflict dynamics in the region, which I think provides an excellent entry point then to connect this with the session that Jonathan will be speaking on, which essentially is around geopolitical realignments in the region, and not just whether it's DRC or Kigali, but more broadly in the region. We've seen both DRC, the ambassadors, and putting a very spirited fight in the UN Security Council, and then the UN Security Council also coming up with the resolution. We've seen pronouncements from the European Commission, sort of and recently I think the British government or the UK government sort of suspended development aid and military training with Rwanda, precisely because of the conflict in the Eastern DRC. So I want to bring you in here, Jonathan, to speak more specifically on these issues. What are the implications of the conflict for the wider region from an international perspective? And this can be whether at the international level, but also more specifically at the regional level. And what are some of the prospects and challenges for a joint East African and SADC mediation effort? We saw, I think, early this week, a document was leaked that certain high profile prominent members had been sort of appointed mediators to the conflict in the Eastern DRC to help move this process forward. And what do you think international actors, particularly the African Union, can do? What can the UN do? What can the EU do? What can the US? And even other actors, we mentioned earlier Turkey's role in the conflict. What do you think can happen? And do these actors have actually the do they have the leeway or the power to help move this peace process forward? But then before you come in, Jonathan, I also want to let our audience know that you can send in your questions in the chat, and then you can direct it to a specific panelist. But then if it's an open question, that's pretty much okay, and then we'll take them at the very end. Over to you, Jonathan.
Thank you for inviting me for this. Yeah, the massive complexities that we have in Congo that seems to, for the last few decades, ever since the Rwandan Civil War, which kind of triggered what's been going on now, as Bram stated very clearly. Actually, before going into the international, just quickly, something that Bram suggested that I comment on, of kind of Rwandan perceptions of what's going on, in particular with the FDLR, the Democratic Forces for the Liberation of Rwanda. These are the remnants of the genocide forces that killed up to 1 million people in 100 days in 1994. It's more the ideological children of the genocide, because it's been 30 years, and how in Rwanda, and this will connect to the international, in Rwanda, the FDLR and some of its allies are perceived not as a threat to overthrowing the state, despite the FDLR's intent. One of its main goals doing that is to return to Rwanda to finish the genocide and return the country into ethnic divisions. But for Rwanda, the FDLR poses an ontological threat, this threat against the new identity that the Rwandan government has been trying to promote over the last 30 years of, we are not Hutu, Tutsi, and Twa anymore, we are Rwandan, we are ethnically Rwandan. And what's been very effective, and as we see with the suspension of aid from Belgium, the partial suspension of the United Kingdom, the comments that are coming from the EU, as well as the US State Department, I think a bit foolishly just sanctioning Minister of State General James Kabarebe out of kind of nowhere. Rwanda has been able to illustrate its state and security interests in Congo, specifically around the FDLR, to international partners very well over the last decade, as well as illustrating kind of the quagmire, which has been most of the Congo. While the M23 is like the big flavor of the month right now, the Congo has over 100 rebel groups, 150. A lot of them are village-based, but you have around 40 major ones with the FDLR, for instance, being one of the big triggers of the M23's new offensive beginning just a few years ago. But even before the offensive began, there were rumors, comments, and people were talking to me from Congo, from Goma, complaining about persecutions against the Kiwanda speakers in the region, and how this was eventually going to lead to something. I think when it comes to the international perspective, this situation, no matter how horrible it is, it's still in Africa. It's still in the middle of Africa. And I feel, and I know this is debated, but I feel kind of the Mogadishu line is still there. In terms of the international consciousness, especially with the issues that are going on right now. I think especially with Europe, why they've gone the route that they have with Congo and Rwanda is because which is a repetition of what they did 10 years ago during the first wave, the first offensive of the M23, or previous rebel groups before then, or even the Second Congo War, repeating those kind of those foreign policies when it comes to Rwanda and Congo, is because there's such uncertainty with Europe right now, with President Donald Trump. That what's going to happen exactly with Ukraine, what's happening in the Middle East, are we going to get a new wave of migration? And just that US protection that has seemed to be guaranteed with NATO for decades seems to be now up in the air. So the EU and I'm throwing the UK in there as well. I know not all Brits would be happy with me doing that, but Europe is looking at African conflicts, and especially after the coups in the Sahel, how France kind of botched its missions there. They're looking at, like, these are situations that are worrisome because of the humanitarian cost, but we got bigger issues to handle. We got bigger fears as well of our own security that we haven't seen in decades. So there's kind of been this default of, okay, what are the old narratives of understanding the conflicts that have gone in the Congo? Okay, Rwanda must be involved because they led under General James Kabarebe the first Congo War. They overthrew Mobutu nearly single-handedly. Them with the Ugandan forces and Burundi and Angola helped in the end as well in the West. But then the second Congo War, we see General Kabarebe as well heavily involved. We see the Rwandans involved. Now, unlike the first Congo War, the second was much more of a political mess in terms of African nations not all being united, but heavily divided. And we are seeing that a bit again. And I agree with Marissa of how the Congolese government right now, the president, is trying to form relationships anywhere he kind of can. But also keeping an arm's distance because he is playing two games, one on the international stage, trying to show, look at us, look what's happening, you need to help me. There's rumors, God knows if they're true or not, that there was even suggestions that Congo would, for US support, would do a mineral deal. I just think there was the news reports of Trump and Ukraine with that. So maybe someone's replicating that with Congo. How true it is, well, we don't know. But as well as domestically, when he began his presidency, it was very, as the previous two speakers mentioned, it was not in the greatest circumstances. The shadow of Kabila is still very strong, and he spent the first few years, Felix, trying to secure his own political position through domestic reforms, through trying to outmaneuver Joseph Kabila's allies in the military, which caused a lot of tension, to such a point that, you know, there were rumors that a coup might happen a year or two ago. And he did have that initial relationship with Paul Kagame, with Rwanda, trying to increase the relationship there, thinking that Rwanda, you know, they know the Congo very well. They know Eastern Congo very well. And maybe if we get them on our side, then we can secure Eastern Congo as well. But this was very unappetizing to a lot of Congolese who see a country 1/80th their size, who's invaded them 1.5 times. That's not someone that you necessarily want to get friendly with or too friendly with. So he massively backtracked. So with the international community, especially in the African Union, that's the discussions that have been going on with the EAC and SADC of these that a military option isn't ideal or isn't working, that we need the mediation, we need the political conversations. However, and this is fundamentally the only thing that's really going to solve the crisis. The Congolese military, the FARDC, has illustrated that they are unable to fight the M23, as well as their allies, Burundi, who have sent soldiers in and they haven't been as successful, as well as my groups and FDLR and their allies. They have not been successful. But Felix the Congolese president has not wanted to give up on that military option, despite, you know, many I think most people who study strategic theory or military studies would say this isn't a war that you're necessarily going to win. And war is inherently just an outcome of politics, a policy. So fundamentally, there needs to be the change. So, but as Marissa said, how can, if the Congolese government isn't interested in that political mediation, and they have, how can the international community really respond to that when that's really the only option? And that has been very consistent in how all these countries have responded in Africa to the situation in Congo is, yes, Rwanda needs to withdraw, this the M23 needs to stop, there needs to be a ceasefire, but there's always been the constant of there needs to be the negotiations, there needs to be some form of political solution. But with Kinshasa being against that, it's very difficult for international actors to actually push the Congolese government into that. And I think there is this kind of default action, not just with the situation in Europe and the United States and security threats, that has led to a repetition of past policies. But there's also kind of the default of the situation isn't necessarily going to change, that things repeat because Congo has all these fundamental problems that the international community would love to have a quick fix for, but fundamentally this will take years, really decades of state construction. And this is a partially part of the legacy of Belgian colonization, but as well as just failed political governance since the first, and in particular after the Second Congo War, that there hasn't been a state that leads, thus a weakened economy that leads a lot of people in their late teens and their 20s, when the options are to either work in a mine or be agricultural workers or pick up a gun that provides more financial opportunities and join a rebel group. That's what fundamentally a lot do. And the DDR programs that have been heavily paid for by the international community have largely failed. Something also that the international community needs to self-examine, saying about the policies that we push, the money that we put into the Congo to try to create stability, to create peace in the future, and etc. How much of that has been successful or not? And I don't think, especially what's happening in Washington right now, kind of with Elon Musk blowing everything up, I don't think too many organizations, too many international organizations and nations want to actually have that conversation, fearing what's happening, that they don't want to be seen doing something similar as what Musk is doing as well. So fundamentally, the international community will probably push, especially Europe and the US and China as well, will push the diplomatic efforts more onto the African Union, where African states are one, divided about the situation, but as well as realizing that this is a massively internal crisis, that while we can wag our fingers at the Rwanda government, fundamentally, this is something that the Congolese government needs to handle and fix themselves, and how the underlying norm of post-colonial Africa has been internal affairs should really be internal and should not be, other nations shouldn't really get that involved or that heavily, at least outright heavily involved. And just also one last big thing is around a little bit, maybe a year ago, maybe more, there was a massive mix-up in the Rwanda government, where you had new chief of staff in the military, General Mubarak, who is a tactician and operations guru in the military, take over. But in particular, you had the senior security advisor to President Paul Kagame, James Kabarebe, moved into the foreign ministry, and I was with him right before that happened, and then I was talking to him just days after he got moved over. And this was way before M23 took Goma, but this was still during the rise. And during talks with him and other people in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, as well as the Rwandan Defense Force, the scene about General Kabarebe's movement, I kept on being told this response of, Rwanda knows that it's going to have to deal with international blowback with the situation in Congo because of Rwanda's history. Who better to lead Rwanda's side of those conversations than the guy who probably knows Congo nearly more than anyone else, which has benefited Rwanda, why there hasn't been the same coordination of like foreign aid withdrawals that we saw in the early 2010s.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, for your interventions. Extremely insightful again, and thank you so much. We have a very busy chat here. I think we have over 20 questions. I don't think we have time to go through all of them, but I'll do my best, to at least maybe have a few that we can discuss. But generally also, to let the panelists know, I think our audience appreciate the discussion. They say it's a very balanced discussion. So thank you so much. Maybe the first question I can quickly direct it to Bram, and it comes from an anonymous attendee. And they say, looking at yesterday's incident where some bombs were thrown out of the Congolese civilians in Bukavu, where M23 was having a mass gathering, do you think is behind that incident? I'm assuming they meant, do you think M23 is behind the incident, and why do you think so? And do you still believe that there might be a successful peace agreement? Thank you. Maybe I can just take on a few questions and then, throw them, around the panel. And then the other question comes from Gabriela, and then they say, why would M23, or what would M23 gain from entering the territory of Burundi and involving them in the conflict? Do you know whether M23 has such intentions, and what is the position and actions of the Burundian government vis-a-vis the M23 in this conflict? So maybe I can direct this one to Jonathan, since Bram has another question already. And then there's also a question to you. Could you please give your opinion on the Wazalendo? They seem unorganized, decentralized, and without a clear agenda. How do you see their role in this conflict? And do you think they will have another long-term militia in Eastern DRC? So maybe, Bram or Jonathan, you can also respond to this, or Marisa, if you are interested. And then I think I'll quickly look for another. Okay, so there's someone who says, I want to ask anyone among the panelists, I think I'll direct this to Marisa, what do they think about the presence of UN troops, MONUSCO, which has taken longer, almost 28 years plus? Do you really think that these troops have fulfilled their task on what they're supposed to do in dealing with the FDLR and any other army groups? Maybe I can take another 2 or 3 questions. Okay, the Ugandan army has in recent days reinforced its presence in the Congolese provinces of Ituri and North Kivu, officially to oppose the ADF, but perhaps to control or support the offensive of the M23 and the Rwandan government in North and South Kivu. But it now seems to have disappeared. And then I don't think this is a question, it's probably a statement. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, nothing is clear anymore. Indeed, some local sources denounce that the uniform worn does not always correspond to a real membership of the regular army. And then they go on to give examples. And then the EU's political absolute silence against an adequate European military role in this African region within the UN. Is the EU inadequate political position not in line with the EU present military role, also in terms of arms sales, if not else, and with the dramaticity of the regional security situation? I think this is a question. And then last question to Jonathan, this one more specifically. It says, do you think that these Western countries are going to repeat the same mistakes made in 2013 while dealing with this conflict in the Eastern DRC? What are the reasons behind all their intentions? And I mean, maybe last question from me is, recently we've also had lobby groups, DRC, lobby groups in Europe in particular, who I think put pressure on the European Parliament and also the European Commission to act on Rwanda. Do you think these lobby groups have been successful? I think they've also put out a plan, to sort of something along, having to do with increasing transparency, especially when it comes to to resources or critical minerals that Europe needs, for its just energy transition in Europe. So these lobby groups are, coming in, putting pressure on EU, particularly to implement a plan that will ensure that whatever resources are generated out of the Eastern DRC are not, blood resources in a sense, but also to increase transparency, especially given concerns around, smuggling of mineral resources and, all this stuff. So I'll let you respond, and yeah. We can start either way, whoever is prepared. No need for the format that we followed. So anyone who wants to come in, please come.
Okay, thank you. I will respond to the first question you mentioned on the bombing incident yesterday in Bukavu. To be honest, I don't know who is behind this. What we have seen is we have seen accusations flown against each other. So M23 accusing Tshisekedi of being behind the incident, and Kinshasa itself accusing this of being a false flag operation. I would have no idea, but there is a high circulation of weapons in Bukavu. At least there was, because the city was abandoned by the Congolese army prior to the entry of M23, and so it's difficult to say who was behind that incident and why would that be. When it comes to peace agreements, if a successful peace agreement can still go on, this is a very difficult question to answer. I think first of all, there have been already so many peace agreements, and so also on the regional frameworks, there are several regional frameworks that have been created in the past, from the International Conference of the Great Lakes region, the pact, it's backed to the PSC framework that was created after the previous 2013 rebellion, and so these frameworks are not respected. They include respect for the sovereignty of neighboring countries, of non-interference in internal affairs, and it's very clear that this is not being respected at the moment. And also prior peace agreements, specifically the Sun City Accords that ended the Second Congo War, created provisions for power sharing arrangements. And I also think we have to look these systems critically against the light. So we have to hold those against the light. I do want to say about peace processes that, as Marissa mentioned, there was a Nairobi process, there was the Luanda process, and those two tracks ran somewhat parallel to each other, and they allowed for some form of forum shopping, you could say. So it's true that the Congolese government has not been very willing to engage with the Nairobi process, although M23 also stepped out of this process. But also the dynamic of, because the Nairobi process was basically a inter-Congolese affair, so a dialogue between the Congolese government and Congolese armed groups. The dynamic of the Wazalendo, which I will answer also in a bit, which means this mobilization of armed groups, the creation of an army reserve force with promises of future integration of armed groups into this reserve force, undermined also the provisions of the Nairobi process, which was actually in support of a DDR process, which would not be linked to army integration, but to community integration. And so there's been this undermining of Nairobi process, but at the same time, the Luanda process, Rwanda also stepped out of this process by adding this demand that the Congolese government includes commitments to a dialogue with M23 within the Luanda process, which was never part of the discussion before, as has been confirmed by Angola as well recently. So I think merging those two processes is a positive step in the right direction, but you need the carrots and sticks in order to keep all the actors at the table. I think we do need this regional process as well, involving the DRC and Rwanda. But we also need to think about security guarantees for Rwanda. And so this remains for me a rather open question. On the, I will just go right to the question of Wazalendo then before I pass the floor to the other panelists. So the Wazalendo phenomenon itself, it is not a militia in itself. It is rather a on the one hand, it is a coalition, a platform for engagement of several local armed groups, many of which were my groups or local militias that already existed. So it's not, in a sense, the creation of a new militia. It's rather a loose coalition, but also a mobilization for youth to engage in, to be mobilized in fighting. And so I do think that it is rather decentralized. There have been efforts to centralize them, to create a structure morally in what is called the Volontaires pour la Défense de la Patrie, which is a more formalized effort to mobilize civilians into a structure, armed groups in the structure that would later possibly be integrated into the Army Reserve Force. And this is part of this pattern of militarization that I mentioned in my presentation. And I do agree with other observers that this dynamic will probably pose problems in the future, because we have seen these kind of efforts in the past. And often these efforts are being done in response to Rwanda-backed rebellions, SM-23. And I think it is important to state that there is this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy that is happening, because every time we have these rebellions with this foreign support, we see this mobilization of armed groups on the terrain, and we see this kind of fragmentation of the army in life, like we saw maybe when the Russia invasion in Ukraine also showed how in life we could see how the Russian army actually had all these weaknesses. The same we see with the Congolese army, but also these linkages between Congolese army and FDLR. These are often in a response to these rebellions. And so there is this self-fulfilling prophecy that is actually visible here. And it's kind of this paradox of interventionism that only worsens the situation. So I do think that the withdrawal of Rwanda is a crucial element into addressing the situation, because they worsen the situation on the terrain. The position of Congolese Tutsi, hate speech, etc., those often increase in response to these rebellions, not the other way around.
Thank you so much, Abraham. I think we have less than 5 minutes to wrap up. So can I ask that Marisa and Jonathan, you are very quick in your interventions. You don't have to respond to all the questions, but select the ones that you think are most important. And please, so that we wrap up in the next 5 minutes.
Okay, I'll go as quickly as I can with the questions. When it comes to the M23 going into Burundi, I would be very surprised if they actually go into Burundi. They will probably do what they've done with like the Ugandan Rwandan border and just kind of stop when they get to the border, because they know it's a whole new conflict. It's a whole new war if they go into Burundi, and the level of support, whether formally or informally, by different countries who are trying to promote a peace process, a negotiation, a mediation, they know that they're going to lose those country supports if they go into Burundi. But the situation in Burundi is also very chaotic. They have many issues as well. And I'll just go into, when it comes to the Western countries, I think they are going to, as we're kind of saying, they are making the same mistakes as they did in the early 2010s by not trying to really get to the fundamental root of the conflict, which is fundamentally poor governance, a lack of economic opportunities for so many Congolese, more rebel groups than one can count, whether major or minor, like the Mai Mai. And fundamentally, Kinshasa, Congo is a massive country that's not really tied together as well as I think it should be in terms of even just basic infrastructure, let alone governance. Many people in the East don't feel like Kinshasa actually cares about their concerns, issues, and their underdevelopment, let alone conflicts. But the international community, especially with everything going on right now with global conflicts, issues, and etc., they're going to want the easiest solution they can. and that will be just accusing Rwanda. I'm actually kind of surprised that Uganda hasn't received more criticism, because a lot of the current M23 leadership were the ones who fled to Uganda and then came back from Uganda. Thus, repeating what they did in the early 2010s, which is kind of actually good for the Rwanda government in an aspect, because it does help rally national support. The amount of support that General Kabarebe has received since the US sanctions is massive. But unfortunately, yeah, we a lot of times just want the easy answers. And when it comes to with the EU and other countries providing military support, the arms sales, that will actually be very interesting. What is going to happen with that, because of what's happening out of Washington, NATO, and now with so many European governments now claiming that they want to increase military spending to GDP. Will that impact sales into Africa, and with the possibility of US military support being withdrawn from Ukraine, still hasn't happened, but could be. I could definitely see the European countries reorienting military sales to Ukraine, because that is a state threat right very close on their borders that they're going to care more about than a conflict in Africa.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Marisa, please.
I'll be brief. So the question about, has MONUSCO been effective, part of the whole UN peacekeeping, has it been, I think, as effective as it could have been, I think was the question. I mean, I think no. Look, peacekeeping efforts are very difficult, and as we've been discussing here today, it's a very complex and very old problem that is facing the Great Lakes region. But in terms of, I think the UN had became a lot more vocal about M23 being backed by Kigali in the last 2 to 3 years. After mentioning it, I think it was back in 2012 or 2013, but it hasn't maybe been as forthright as it could have been, considering that it is so close to the front line, not just with the peacekeeping mission, but just, I mean, if you look at the East, Goma, for example, is just one of the biggest centers, for all of the UN distribution points, through the World Food Program, UNDP, and all of that. So yeah, I think it hasn't been as vocal as it could have been. There are obviously issues there that did come up over the years, which Tshisekedi said were part of the reason for its withdrawal, but not really, because it's much more political. But obviously, allegations of sexual assault on civilians, and this has been part of the reason why it hasn't been able to get that local buy-in. So for sure, I think MONUSCO is a necessary force there. I think removing them from the country just leaves a vacuum, as Tshisekedi did want to do originally, but certainly it has not. It has made mistakes along the way. And then the other thing I wanted to comment on was, Darlington, you mentioned the lobby groups in Europe speaking about we need transparency in these critical minerals chains. I hate to be so cynical, but I just, the unfortunate thing is that mining is how we've built our entire world, whether it's coal used for steel or for power, whether it's critical minerals, now that are in technology. And we see this all over the world. We can ask for more transparency, but these routes just get diverted, or they just get covered up. And I think we've seen this most acutely with the outbreak of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Still, companies found ways to buy Russian gas. They tried to get around, blocks on payment systems. Again, those sanctions placed on, Russia by the US have not really had that widespread impact, because the world is just far too interconnected. And I think with critical minerals, I think it's a really good fight to ask for more transparency. I don't really know if it really has an impact, just because of how we set everything up. But I mean, it's certainly an ideal to strive for. I just don't know how effective it would be.
Okay, thank you so much, Marisa. So I think we've come to the end of our webinar, but before I hand over to Maria Luisa, I want to extend a very big thanks to our panelists, and also our audience. You've been extremely engaged, and this has been an interesting discussion. So thank you very much. Over to you, Maria.
Thank you, Darlington. No need actually for more words. I want also to extend my thanks to Bram, Jonathan, and Marisa. I think we have had both the opportunity to look at the historical aspect, the sociological aspect, but also tackle the policy aspect of this conflict. And what personally struck me, it's really how when such a dangerous escalation could happen, even and involve also the neighboring country, and how basically the mechanism to stop that are basically no longer. They were already difficult to be in place before, but now at this moment of global crisis, even the less. And I think this is something that has emerged from all the three presentations. Thank you again for connecting, and please keep tuned to our webinar series at EAI. And thank you again, and have a wonderful week, and thank you.